The rope snapped tight with a sound like a gunshot, vibrating so violently it burned through the leather of Elias's gloves instantly. He didn't have time to think, only to react, digging his boot heels into the crumbling shale of the canyon rim. Below him, dangling over 300 feet of empty air and jagged rock, the massive black stallion kicked and thrashed, his squeals of terror echoing off the canyon walls like the cries of a doomed spirit. The horse, Brimstone, had slipped. It was a freak accident, a patch of ice hidden under snow, and now 2,000 pounds of panic hung by a single braided line wrapped around Elias's waist and the saddle horn of his own mount, a sturdy mare who was groaning under the strain. Elias felt his ribs creaking. He was being dragged inch by agonizing inch toward the edge. He looked down. The stallion's eyes were wide, rolling white with madness, staring up at him. If Elias cut the rope, the horse died instantly. If he held on, they would both go over. The mare's hooves slipped backward, sending a shower of pebbles into the abyss. Elias reached for his knife, his hand shaking, the wind screaming in his ears, and he looked into the terrified eyes of the beast he had sworn to save. If you want to see how a bond like this is forged in fire, and if you believe that loyalty is worth fighting for, please take a second to subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us keep the campfire burning and these stories coming to you. The wind didn't just blow in the high country of the Bitterroot Mountains, it hunted. It sought out the gaps in a man's coat and the cracks in his resolve, chilling him down to the marrow of his bones. But long before Elias Thorne found himself holding the weight of a life on a canyon ledge, he was just a man walking into a dusty corral with a limp in his left leg and a shadow over his heart that no amount of noon sun could burn away. It was early October when he arrived at the Double Bar Ranch, a sprawling, unforgiving stretch of land that chewed up greenhorns and spat them out before breakfast. Elias wasn't a greenhorn, though. He was something worse. He was a man who had outlived his best days and was trying to outrun his worst ones. He carried his saddle over his shoulder, the leather worn smooth and dark like old mahogany, and his face was a map of hard years, etched with lines that deepened when he squinted against the glare. The foreman, a thick-necked man named Silas who smelled of chewing tobacco and skepticism, looked Elias up and down with a sneer. He saw the grey in Elias's beard, the way he favored that left leg, and the quiet, almost haunted look in his eyes. Silas spat into the dust, a brown stream that sizzled on the dry earth. He asked if Elias was looking for work or a grave, because out here they were often the same thing. Elias didn't smile. He just dropped his saddle on the rail and asked about the horse. Everyone knew about the horse. Word traveled fast in the territory, faster than a telegraph. They said the Double Bar had a devil in the flesh, a stallion so wild and full of hate that 3 men had already been broken trying to sit on his back. One had a shattered pelvis, another had lost the use of his arm. The third just packed his bag in the middle of the night and left, muttering about demons. Silas laughed, a dry, barking sound that had no humor in it. He pointed toward the isolation pen, a reinforced enclosure built of thick pine logs and iron bolts, set apart from the main barn as if it contained a contagion. He told Elias to go ahead and look, but warned him not to get too close to the rails unless he wanted to lose a finger. Elias walked over, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. The air was thick with the smell of sage and pine resin, but near the pen there was another smell, the sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline and fear. He approached the fence slowly, keeping his hands visible, his breathing steady. Inside, pacing the perimeter like a caged tiger, was the animal. He was magnificent and terrifying all at once. His coat was the color of midnight, a black so deep it seemed to absorb the light around him. He stood 17 hands high, with muscles that rippled under his skin like water over stones. His mane was a tangled storm of black hair, and his tail swept the ground. But it was the eyes that stopped Elias cold. They weren't the soft, questioning eyes of a domesticated animal. They were intelligent, burning with a fierce, calculated rage. The horse stopped pacing as Elias approached. He turned his massive head, ears pinned flat against his skull, and let out a snort that blew dust from the ground. This was Brimstone. The name fit. He looked like something forged in the fires of the earth, beautiful and dangerous. Elias didn't back down, But he didn't challenge the horse either. He just stood there, leaning his arms on the top rail, watching. He saw the scars on the horse's flanks, old marks from whips and spurs, the telltale signs of men who tried to conquer strength with pain. He saw the way the horse flinched when a bird flew too close, a sign of nerves shattered by cruelty. Elias knew that look. He felt it in his own chest, the echo of a past he couldn't fix. He had failed his brother Samuel years ago in a river crossing not unlike the dangers of this land. He had let go when he should have held on. That guilt was a stone he carried every day, a weight heavier than any saddle. Looking at Brimstone, Elias didn't see a monster. He saw a creature that had been betrayed by the very hands that were supposed to guide it. He went back to Silas and took the job. The foreman thought he was crazy, told him he wouldn't last a week and that the ranch wouldn't pay for his burial. Elias didn't care about the money. He needed this. He needed to prove to himself that something broken could be mended, that a wild thing could be understood rather than crushed. He set up his bedroll in the tack room of the barn, close enough to hear the stallion's movements in the night. For the first 3 days, Elias didn't even open the gate. He just sat on the fence hour after hour, whittling a piece of cedar and humming a low, tuneless melody. He let Brimstone get used to his smell, to the sound of his voice, to the fact that this human wasn't coming at him with a rope or a whip. The other hands on the ranch watched him with amusement. They made bets on how long it would take for the old man to get stomped. They called him the Ghost because he barely spoke to anyone, saving all his words for the horse. But Elias wasn't listening to them. He was listening to the horse. He learned that Brimstone paced clockwise when he was angry and counterclockwise when he was anxious. He learned that the horse hated the sound of metal clanking, but was curious about the smell of apples. He learned that the rage wasn't just anger, it was a defense mechanism, a wall built to keep out the pain. On the 4th day, Elias opened the gate. He didn't bring a halter. He didn't bring a rope. He just walked into the center of the pen and sat down in the dirt, crossing his legs. The reaction was immediate. Brimstone charged. The ground shook under the impact of his hooves, a thunderous rhythm that would have sent a lesser man scrambling for the fence. Elias didn't move, he didn't flinch. He kept his head down, looking at the dust, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He could feel the wind of the horse's approach, the heat of his body. At the last second, Brimstone veered away, kicking up a cloud of grit that coated Elias's face. The horse circled him, snorting, confused. Why didn't the man run? Why didn't he fight? Elias stayed there for 2 hours. He spoke softly, telling the horse about the mountains, about the river, about the brother he lost. He poured his confession into the air, words he hadn't spoken to a living soul in 10 years. He told Brimstone that he was sorry for what men had done to him. He told him that he wasn't there to break him, but to ask for a partnership. It sounded foolish talking to a beast like that, but Elias knew that horses understood the tone of a soul, even if they didn't know the words. By the time Elias stood up to leave, his legs were stiff and his back ached, but the horse had stopped pacing. Brimstone was watching him, his ears pricked forward, the rage in his eyes replaced by a wary curiosity. The weeks that followed were a slow, grinding dance of patience. Winter was coming early to the mountains. The air turned crisp, and frost began to coat the fence rails in the mornings. Elias worked from dawn until dusk. He started with touch. It took 5 days just to get a hand on Brimstone's shoulder. The horse trembled, his muscles bunching tight as steel cables, waiting for the blow. When it didn't come, when Elias's rough hand just rested there, warm and steady, a shudder went through the animal's body. It was a release, a letting go. Elias groomed him, brushing out the tangles in his mane, talking low and steady. He cleaned the old wounds, applying salve to the scars that still looked angry and red. But the real test wasn't grooming. It was trust. The ranch needed horses that could work, that could handle the rough terrain and the cattle. Silas was getting impatient. He told Elias that if the horse wasn't saddle broken by the first snow, he was selling him to the glue factory. The threat hung over Elias's head like a storm cloud. He knew Brimstone wasn't ready for a saddle, not yet. The trauma was too deep, but he had no choice. He had to push just a little. The first time Elias brought the saddle into the pen, Brimstone reverted. He reared up, striking the air with his front hooves, screaming his defiance. The trust they had built seemed to evaporate in a second. Elias retreated, his heart sinking. He realized he couldn't force this. He had to change the method. He left the saddle on the fence rail for 3 days, letting it just be a part of the scenery. He let Brimstone sniff it, nudge it, realize it wasn't a monster. When he finally placed the blanket on the horse's back, he did it with a reverence usually reserved for holy objects. Brimstone flinched, his skin twitching, but he stood his ground. It was a cold Tuesday morning when Elias finally cinched the girth. The horse stood rigid, his breathing shallow and fast. Elias didn't mount, he just walked him, leading him around the pen, letting him feel the weight and the restriction. They did this for hours, circles in the dust, until the sweat froze on the horse's coat. When Elias finally put his boot in the stirrup, the ranch hands gathered by the fence, silent for once. They expected an explosion. They expected blood. Elias swung his leg over. He settled his weight gently, not clamping down with his legs, keeping his hands soft on the reins. Brimstone froze. For a long, terrible minute, neither of them moved. It was a battle of wills, silent and invisible. Then Brimstone let out a long, shuddering breath and lowered his head. He didn't buck. He didn't fight. He accepted the weight. Elias felt a lump form in his throat. It wasn't victory. It was a gift. The horse was giving him a chance. But the mountains didn't care about moments of grace. The weather turned vicious in November. A blizzard struck with little warning, burying the passes in 6 feet of snow. The cattle were scattered in the high pastures, and every man was needed to bring them down before they froze to death. Silas ordered Elias to take Brimstone. It was too soon, Elias argued. The horse was green. He hadn't seen the high trails, hadn't faced the deep drifts or the predators. Silas didn't want to hear it. If he's a cow horse, he works, Silas barked. If he ain't, he's dog food, ride him out. Elias rode out with a heavy heart. The wind was already picking up, biting through his wool coat. Brimstone was nervous, dancing sideways as the snow crunched under his hooves. The world was a white blur, the landmarks erased by the storm. They rode for hours, pushing higher into the timberline, searching for the strays. The cold was numbing, a dull ache that settled in the fingers and toes. Elias had to trust the horse's footing because he could barely see past the animal's ears. They found a small group of heifers huddled in a box canyon, shivering and half-buried. Elias went to work, shouting over the wind, pushing the cattle toward the lower trail. Brimstone was surprisingly good. He had a natural cow sense, anticipating the movements of the herd, cutting off the strays with quick, agile bursts of speed. For a moment, Elias felt a surge of pride. They were doing it. They were a team. Then disaster struck. A loud crack echoed through the valley. A dead pine tree, heavy with ice, snapped under the weight of the wind. It crashed down right in front of them, a massive explosion of snow and wood. The heifers scattered in panic. Brimstone, startled by the noise and the sudden movement, reared back violently. Elias, his hands numb and his reaction time slowed by the cold, lost his seat. He was thrown clear, landing hard on a patch of ice. He felt a sickening pop in his shoulder, and the world went grey for a second. When he cleared his vision, he saw Brimstone bolting. The horse was running blind with fear, heading straight for the steep incline that led to the upper ridge, a place where the footing was treacherous even in summer. "No!" Elias screamed, scrambling to his feet, ignoring the fire in his shoulder. "Brimstone, stand!" But the horse was gone, disappearing into the whiteout. Elias was alone, injured, miles from the ranch, with a storm raging around him. He stumbled forward, following the tracks. He couldn't leave him. He wouldn't fail another soul. He pushed through the drifts, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He tracked the horse for a mile, the trail leading dangerously close to the Devil's Drop, a sheer cliff that fell away into the river gorge below. The tracks told a story of panic. The horse had been sliding, scrambling, and then the tracks stopped. Elias reached the edge of the drop. The wind here was ferocious, threatening to blow him over. He peered over the rim, his heart stopping in his chest. There, on a narrow shelf of rock about 20 feet down, stood Brimstone. The horse was trapped. The ledge was no wider than a dinner table covered in ice. Above him was the sheer rock face. Below him was a 300-foot drop. The horse was trembling so violently that he was shaking snow loose from the cliff. He looked up at Elias, and in that look, the wildness was gone. There was only the terrified plea of a child asking for help. Elias didn't have a rope long enough to reach him from the saddle, and his mare had run off with the other cattle. He had the coil of emergency rope on his belt, but it was thin. He looked at the tree roots exposed near the edge. They were slick with ice. He had to go down there. He had to get a halter on the horse and try to guide him up a narrow goat path that cut diagonally across the face, a path that was barely visible under the snow. "I'm coming, boy," Elias whispered, his voice lost in the wind. "I ain't leaving you." He tied the rope to a sturdy pine at the top and began to lower himself down. His bad shoulder screamed in protest, sending waves of nausea through him. Every movement was a gamble. The rocks were slick as glass. He reached the ledge and landed softly, but the vibration was enough to make Brimstone shy. The horse's back hooves slipped over the edge, scrabbling for purchase on empty air. Rocks clattered down, falling for seconds before hitting the bottom. "Easy," Elias crooned, holding out a hand. "Easy, son. Look at me. Just look at me." He inched closer. The horse was hyperventilating, the whites of his eyes showing. Elias could smell the animal's terror. He reached out and touched the horse's nose. It was ice cold. "I got you," he said. "We walk out of this together or we don't walk out at all." The ledge was a frozen purgatory, a sliver of stone suspended between the howling sky and the jagged teeth of the river gorge below. Elias moved with the slow, deliberate heaviness of a man walking underwater. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to press his back against the cliff face and squeeze his eyes shut, but he couldn't afford the luxury of fear. Not now. Brimstone was trembling so violently that his hooves were creating a staccato rhythm on the ice, a tap dance of panic that threatened to send them both over the edge. Elias took a breath that tasted of ice crystals and pine needles, forcing his own heart to slow down. He knew that horses were mirrors. If he showed terror, Brimstone would shatter. He unbuckled his heavy sheepskin coat, his fingers clumsy and numb, and slowly peeled it off. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a hammer to the chest that stole his breath, but he needed the coat. He moved toward the stallion's head, murmuring a stream of nonsense words, low and rhythmic, a lullaby for the damned. He draped the heavy coat over Brimstone's eyes, tucking the sleeves into the halter to secure it. Blindfolding a panicked horse on a cliff edge was a gamble that would make a poker player sweat, but sight was the enemy here. If Brimstone could see the drop, he would freeze or fight. Elias needed him to feel, not see. "Trust me, you stubborn devil," Elias whispered, his teeth chattering. "I'm your eyes now." He grabbed the cheek piece of the halter with his good hand, his bad shoulder throbbing with a dull, sickening ache that radiated down to his fingertips. He turned his back to the wind and tugged gently. "Step," he commanded. "Step up." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The wind tore at Elias's flannel shirt, biting into his skin. Then Brimstone shifted his weight. He took a tentative, blind step forward, his hoof scraping against the rock before finding purchase. Elias guided him toward the goat path, a narrow scar of shale that cut diagonally up the cliff face. It was steep, treacherous, and barely wide enough for a man, let alone a horse. Elias walked backward, his boots slipping on the scree, his eyes fixed on the horse's front legs. Every time Brimstone hesitated, Elias was there, a steady pressure on the halter, a voice in the dark. They moved as one creature, a six-legged beast struggling against gravity. Halfway up, disaster nearly claimed them. A shelf of ice broke under Brimstone's hind leg. The horse slipped, his back end dropping, scrabbling frantically against the void. The weight jerked Elias forward, slamming his bad shoulder into the rock wall. A scream of pain tore from his throat, raw and involuntary. But he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. The memory of the river flashed in his mind, vivid and terrible. The dark water churning, Samuel's hand slipping from his grasp, the look of betrayal in his brother's eyes as the current took him. Elias had let go then. He had saved himself. That moment had rotted inside him for 10 years, a cancer of the soul. He gritted his teeth so hard he felt a molar crack. He leaned back, using his own body weight as a counterbalance, digging his heels into a fissure in the rock. "Climb!" he roared, his voice cracking over the wind. "Climb, damn you!" Brimstone, blinded and terrified, felt the tension in the lead. He felt the man anchoring him. With a grunt of effort that sounded almost human, the stallion lunged forward, his powerful haunches driving him up, his hooves sparking against the flint. He scrambled, slipped and scrambled again, until his front hooves hooked over the rim of the canyon. Elias pulled, his muscles screaming, until the horse hauled himself up and over, collapsing onto the snow-covered plateau. They lay there for a moment, man and beast, gasping for air, the snow melting against their hot skin. Elias's shoulder was on fire, a white-hot agony that made his vision swim, but he was alive, and the horse was alive. But the mountain wasn't done with them. The blizzard had intensified while they were in the canyon. The world was now a featureless void of white, the wind howling like a banshee. Night was falling, a grey gloom that swallowed the landscape. Elias forced himself to stand. If they stayed here, the sweat on Brimstone's coat would freeze and hypothermia would kill the horse in an hour. It would kill Elias in 2. He retrieved his coat from the horse's head, his fingers so stiff he could barely work the buttons. He put it on, trapping the meager warmth against his body, and looked around. The landmarks were gone. The trail back to the ranch was buried under 3 feet of fresh drift. They were lost in the high country, in the dark, in a storm that killed elk and wolves alike. "We can't go back," Elias said to the horse, his voice hollow. "We have to find shelter." He didn't mount. He couldn't. His shoulder was useless, and the deep snow would exhaust the horse if he carried a rider. They had to walk. Elias took the lead rope and started trudging into the wind, head down, aiming for a dark smudge of timber in the distance. It was a grove of ancient spruce trees, their branches interwoven like a roof. It was their only chance. The walk was a death march. The snow was thigh-deep in places, heavy and wet. Every step was a battle. Elias fell twice, his bad leg buckling under the strain. The second time, he didn't want to get up. The cold was seductive now, a warm numbness spreading through his limbs, whispering that it would be easier to just close his eyes and sleep. He lay in the snow, the flakes settling on his eyelashes. Then he felt a hot blast of air on his neck. Brimstone nudged him. The stallion, who had once tried to kill him, was now pushing at his shoulder with his velvet nose, snorting impatiently. The horse nipped at Elias's coat, a sharp tug that said, "Get up." Elias looked into the horse's eyes. The wildness was back, but it wasn't rage anymore. It was the will to survive. It was the same fire that had kept Brimstone fighting in the isolation pen. "All right," Elias groaned, grabbing the stirrup leather to haul himself up. I'm up. He leaned heavily against the horse's shoulder, and for the first time Brimstone leaned back. The horse adjusted his stride to match Elias's limp, breaking the trail through the deepest drifts, using his massive chest as a plow. They weren't master and beast anymore. They were packmates. They reached the timberline as true darkness fell. The spruce grove was dense, the ground beneath the trees relatively dry and protected from the biting wind. It was a cathedral of silence in the midst of the chaos. Elias collapsed at the base of a massive tree, his energy spent. He knew he needed to make a fire, but his hands were useless claws. He couldn't strike a match even if he had dry wood. He huddled into his coat, shivering uncontrollably. Brimstone didn't wander off to forage. The stallion stood over him, lowering his head until his muzzle touched Elias's chest. The horse blew warm air into the opening of Elias's coat. Then, with a heavy sigh, the great beast folded his legs and lay down in the dirt, curling his body around Elias like a giant living wall. Elias froze. A horse like this, a wild thing, never lay down near a predator. It was the ultimate vulnerability. But Brimstone pressed his back against Elias's side, radiating a furnace of heat. Elias hesitated, then shifted, pressing his freezing body against the horse's flank. He buried his hands in the thick winter coat, feeling the slow, powerful beat of the horse's heart. It was a drum in the darkness, steady and strong. As the storm raged outside their sanctuary, burying the world in white, Elias closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about the pain in his shoulder, or the miles they still had to travel. He was thinking that for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't alone in the dark. He had saved the horse, and now the horse was saving him. Morning broke with a deceptive beauty. The sky was a piercing crystalline blue, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding glare. The storm had passed, but it had left a frozen wasteland in its wake. The temperature had plummeted. The air was so cold it burned the lungs. Elias woke with a gasp, his body stiff as old wood. Brimstone was already up, pawing at the snow to find dried grass beneath. Elias tried to stand and cried out. His knee had swollen to the size of a grapefruit, and his shoulder was locked tight. He was in bad shape. He checked his pockets. He had a handful of jerky and a small flask of water that was half frozen. He shared the water with Brimstone, pouring it into his cupped hands for the horse to lick. They had to move. If they stayed, they starved. But as Elias looked out at the expanse of white, he realized he had no idea where they were. The storm had turned the world upside down. The mountains looked different, alien. He scanned the horizon, looking for a peak, a ridge, anything familiar. He saw nothing but endless rolling white. Panic, cold and sharp, began to rise in his gut. Then he saw it, a thin wisp of smoke rising miles to the east, barely visible against the pale sky. A trapper's cabin, a mining camp. It didn't matter, it was life. "Let's go, boy," Elias rasped. He tried to walk, but his leg collapsed immediately. He fell face first into the snow. He couldn't walk. He lay there, defeated, the pain overwhelming. He heard the crunch of hooves. Brimstone stood over him, waiting. The horse looked at the saddle, then at Elias. He sidestepped, positioning himself perfectly alongside the fallen man. He stood rock still, bracing his legs. He was offering. Elias stared at him, tears freezing on his cheeks. This horse, who had thrown 3 men and broken bones, was waiting for him. It took Elias 10 minutes to drag himself up. He used the stirrup like a ladder, gritting his teeth until he tasted blood. He hauled himself into the saddle, a dead weight. Brimstone didn't flinch. Once Elias was settled, slumping forward over the horse's neck, gripping the mane for dear life, the stallion began to walk. He moved with a smoothness Elias had never felt, gliding over the snow, heading unerringly toward the distant smoke. They rode for hours in a silence that felt sacred. But as the sun reached its zenith, the snow began to soften. The crust that had supported them in the morning turned to slush. The going got harder. Brimstone was breathing heavy, his flanks heaving, and then they hit the river valley. The river was frozen over, a ribbon of white winding through the canyon. It was the fastest way to the smoke, but it was deadly. The ice could be thick as a bank vault or thin as paper. Elias tried to steer Brimstone toward the bank, to keep to the trees, but the snow there was chest deep. They had to risk the ice. Elias felt the change in the horse's gait as his hooves touched the river ice. Brimstone's ears flicked back and forth. He didn't like it. The ice groaned under their weight, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the canyon walls. Elias held his breath. "Just a little further," he prayed. "Just get us to the bend." They were in the middle of the channel when it happened. Not a crack, but a sudden, sickening drop. The ice beneath them simply vanished. There was no time to jump, no time to scream. 1 second they were walking, and the next, the world dissolved into freezing black water and shattering ice. The shock of the cold was instant paralysis. Elias was torn from the saddle as Brimstone thrashed, the horse's massive body breaking through the ice shelf, plunging them both into the dark, swirling current of the river. The water grabbed Elias, pulling him down, heavy with his boots and coat. He kicked, his bad leg useless, his good arm flailing. He broke the surface, gasping for air, and saw Brimstone's head bobbing 10 feet away, eyes wide with terror, fighting the current that was dragging them both toward the rapids downstream. The river wasn't water. It was liquid iron, heavy and crushing, stealing the heat from Elias's body in a single violent heartbeat. He tumbled through the black churn, his boots dragging him down like anchors, the roar of the current filling his ears until it drowned out his own thoughts. He struck a submerged boulder with his hip, the pain sharp enough to pierce the numbness, and flailed for the surface. He broke through, gasping, but the air was a knife in his lungs. He spun in the water, desperate, searching for the black shape of the horse. He saw Brimstone 20 yards downstream, his head thrown back, teeth bared, fighting the current that sought to pull him under the ice shelf. The horse was screaming, a gurgling, terrified sound that cut through the roar of the water. "Swim," Elias choked out, though the word was lost in the spray. "Swim to me." He didn't try to swim to the bank, he swam to the horse. It was suicide, and he knew it. The rational part of his brain, the part that wanted to live, told him to grab the overhanging branch of a willow on the shore and haul himself out. But the shadow of his brother Samuel was there in the water with him, a ghost in the spray. Elias kicked with his good leg, ignoring the dead weight of his injured one, and threw himself into the main channel. The current slammed him against Brimstone's flank. The horse thrashed, his hooves churning the water into a froth. A hoof grazed Elias's shoulder, numbing his arm, but he reached out with a desperation born of 10 years of guilt and grabbed a handful of the wet, tangled mane. "Pull!" Elias screamed into the horse's ear. "Pull us out!" Brimstone felt the weight on his neck, but instead of panicking further, the contact seemed to ground him. He had a job. He had a rider. The stallion turned his head, fighting the flow, and drove his powerful legs toward the shallows. They battled the river for an eternity that lasted only minutes, drifting past jagged rocks and shelves of ice. Finally, Brimstone's front hooves struck the gravel of a sandbar. He heaved, his muscles bunching and trembling, dragging his massive frame out of the sucking mud. Elias held on, dragged behind him like a rag doll, until they collapsed onto the frozen bank, coughing up water and shivering so violently their teeth clicked like castanets. They were alive, but the river had only been the first executioner. The cold was the second, and it was far more patient. Elias tried to stand, but his legs were rubber. His clothes were freezing solid, turning into a suit of armor that trapped the ice against his skin. He looked at Brimstone. The horse was in shock. His head hung low, water streaming from his coat, turning to icicles on his belly hair. His eyes were glazed. If they stopped moving, the horse's heart would stop. It was that simple. Elias forced himself up. He couldn't feel his feet. He stumbled to Brimstone and slapped the horse's neck, hard. "Move," he rasped. "We ain't dying today, not here." The smoke he had seen earlier was gone, lost behind the ridge, but Elias had the direction burned into his mind. He grabbed the reins, his fingers stiff claws that wouldn't close properly, and wrapped the leather around his wrist. He began to walk. It was a staggering, drunken march. Every step sent a jolt of agony through his frozen knee. Brimstone followed, his head bumping against Elias's back with every step, seeking warmth, seeking guidance. They were two ghosts wandering in a white hell. The wind picked up again, drying the water on their skin but dropping the temperature even further. Elias felt his mind beginning to drift. He started seeing things that weren't there. A warm fire in the snow, the face of his mother, the barn back at the double bar. He shook his head, biting his tongue until he tasted copper to stay awake. Keep walking, just keep walking. He talked to the horse, a ceaseless, mumbling monologue. He told Brimstone about the spring grass, about the sweet feed in the bin, about how he was going to brush him until he shone like a new coin. He made promises he wasn't sure he could keep. They found the source of the smoke an hour later, just as the sun began to dip below the peaks, painting the snow in shades of bruised purple. It wasn't a camp. It was a trapper's cabin, old and leaning, half buried in a snowdrift against a granite wall. The roof sagged, and the chimney was a pile of loose stones, but a thin wisp of grey still curled from the top. Someone had been here recently, or the fire had been banked deep. Elias stumbled toward the door, dragging Brimstone with him. He reached the rough-hewn planks and pounded on the wood. "Hello," he croaked. "Help!" Silence. The door wasn't locked. It was just swollen shut with damp and ice. Elias threw his shoulder against it, crying out as his injury flared, and the door groaned open. The cabin was empty. A potbelly stove sat in the corner, glowing with the faint, dying embers of a coal fire. There was a single bunk with a rat-eaten mattress and a table with a tin cup. No food, no people, just four walls and a roof. Elias stumbled inside, the warmth of the dying fire hitting him like a physical caress. He almost collapsed right there, but then he felt the tug on his wrist, the reins. Brimstone was outside, standing in the snow, his large frame filling the doorway. The horse tried to step in, but his shoulders were too wide for the narrow frame. He whinnied, a high, pitiful sound of abandonment. Elias looked at the stove, then at the horse. If he left Brimstone outside in this condition, wet, exhausted and freezing, the stallion would be dead by morning. He would freeze, standing up. But the cabin was tiny, barely 10 feet by 10 feet. It was madness to bring a wild stallion into a space that small. It went against every rule of horsemanship. A horse in a confined space would panic, kick the stove over, burn the place down, and kill them both. Elias looked into Brimstone's eyes. The horse was shivering so hard the reins vibrated. He wasn't a wild animal anymore. He was a partner who had pulled Elias from the river. "I ain't leaving you," Elias whispered. He looked at the doorframe. It was rotten pine. Elias grabbed a heavy iron poker from next to the stove. He went to the door and began to smash the wood. He attacked the frame with a frenzy, splinters flying, ignoring the pain in his hands. He tore away the molding, kicked out the rotted jambs, widening the opening inch by inch. He worked until his breath came in sobbing gasps. "Come on," Elias said, stepping back into the room. He pulled on the reins. "Come inside." Brimstone hesitated. The smell of the enclosed space, the smoke, the darkness, it was everything a prey animal feared. But the cold outside was death, and the man was life. The stallion lowered his head. He scraped his sides against the rough wood of the widened frame, stepping gingerly onto the wooden floorboards. His hooves clattered loudly in the small space. He was huge, his head brushing the rafters, his body taking up nearly the entire room. Elias closed the door as best he could, jamming a bench against it to keep the wind out. He turned to face the horse. They were packed in together, the man and the giant beast, in a room smaller than a prison cell. Brimstone stood by the stove, steam beginning to rise from his wet coat. He didn't kick, he didn't rear. He stood frozen, his eyes locked on Elias. Elias fell to his knees by the stove. He found a small pile of dry wood in a box and fed the embers, blowing gently until a flame licked up, bright and orange. The heat began to build. Elias stripped off his frozen coat and hung it on a nail. He then turned to the horse. He took the blanket from the bunk, filthy and smelling of mold, and began to rub Brimstone down. He rubbed until his arms burned, drying the horse's legs, his chest, his flank. The cabin filled with the smell of wet horse and wood smoke. As the night deepened, the wind howled outside, a frustrated beast denied its prey. Inside the fire crackled. Elias sat on the floor, his back against the wall, his bad leg stretched out. Brimstone stood over him, his head drooping with exhaustion. Slowly, incredibly, the horse lowered himself. The floorboards groaned, but they held. The stallion curled up on the rug in front of the stove, his massive head resting on Elias's outstretched leg. Elias rested his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the pulse, slow and steady. He had done the unthinkable. He had brought the wild into the house. And in doing so, he realized that the wild wasn't something to be tamed or broken. It was something to be sheltered. For the first time in his life, Elias slept without dreaming of the river, but peace in the high country is a fragile thing. Elias woke before dawn to a sound that made his blood run cold. It wasn't the wind, it was a low guttural growl, followed by the scratching of claws against the wood of the door. Brimstone's head snapped up, his ears swiveling, his nostrils flaring. The horse scrambled to his feet in the tiny space, knocking over the tin cup, his iron shoes skidding on the wood. Elias grabbed the iron poker, his heart hammering. The scratching came again, louder this time, accompanied by a heavy thud against the door. Something was out there, something big, and it smelled the horse. The door, weakened by Elias's earlier demolition, bowed inward under a massive weight. A nail popped with a sound like a gunshot. Brimstone squealed, backing up until his hindquarters hit the far wall, his eyes rolling white. Elias stood between the horse and the door, raising the iron bar. He was weak, unarmed, and trapped in a box with a panicked stallion and a predator at the gate. "Back!" Elias hissed at the horse, though there was nowhere to go. "Stay back!" The wood splintered. A snout, black and wet, pushed through the crack in the doorframe. It was a mountain lion, gaunt from the winter, desperate and smelling blood. The cat snarled, a terrifying sound that filled the small room. Brimstone reared, his front hooves striking the rafters. dust raining down. If the horse panicked now, he would crush Elias before the cat even got inside. Elias didn't look at the horse. He kept his eyes on the gap in the door, on the yellow eyes staring back at him. He realized with a sinking certainty that the fire was dying, and he had used the last of the wood. They were running out of heat, running out of time, and now they were being hunted. He tightened his grip on the poker. He wasn't going to let the cat have the horse. He would die first. "Come on then," Elias screamed at the door, a challenge born of pure exhaustion and rage. "Come and get it," the cat roared, throwing its full weight against the shattered timber. The bench Elias had used to jam the door slid backward. The door swung open. The mountain lion didn't just enter. It exploded into the room, a blur of tawny fur and muscle that smelled of wet pine and old blood. The beast was starving, its ribs showing through its coat, and desperation made it reckless. It ignored the man and launched itself straight at the horse, its claws extended like curved daggers. Brimstone screamed, a sound that shook the dust from the rafters, and reared up, his front hooves smashing into the low ceiling. The cabin became a blender of violence. The table was smashed to kindling in a second. Elias swung the iron poker with every ounce of strength he had left, aiming for the cat's skull. The metal connected with a sickening thud against the lion's shoulder, but it was like hitting a sack of cement. The cat snarled, spinning in midair with terrifying agility, and lashed out. Elias felt a line of fire erupt across his chest as the claws tore through his flannel shirt and skin. The force of the blow threw him backward, slamming him against the hot stove. He cried out, sliding to the floor, the poker clattering out of reach. The lion landed on all fours, hissing, its yellow eyes locking onto Elias. The man was down. The man was prey. The cat crouched, muscles bunching for the killing spring. Elias looked at the beast, then at the open door. He could see the snow outside. He could see the end. He didn't close his eyes. He just wished he had a gun. But the spring never came. A black shadow eclipsed the light. Brimstone, who could have bolted through the open door to freedom, who could have left the man to be eaten, did not run. Instead, the stallion dropped his head and charged. He didn't bite. He used his mass. He slammed his chest into the lion's flank with the force of a runaway train. The cat was thrown sideways, crashing into the wall with a yowl of surprise. Before the predator could recover, Brimstone spun. In the tight confines of the cabin, it was a miracle of balance. The horse lashed out with his hind legs, a double-barreled kick that packed enough force to shatter oak. Crack! The sound of bone breaking was louder than the wind. One hoof caught the lion square in the ribs, the other grazed its hip. The cat shrieked a high, broken sound, and was launched across the room, tumbling over the debris of the table. It scrambled to its feet, spitting blood, its side heaving unnaturally. It looked at the horse, then at the man, and saw that this was not a meal. This was death. With a low, gurgling growl, the lion turned and limped frantically out the door, disappearing into the white silence of the morning. Silence rushed back into the cabin, heavy and suffocating. Elias lay on the floor, clutching his bleeding chest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was wrecked. The stove was dented, the furniture destroyed. Brimstone stood in the center of the ruin, his sides heaving like bellows, sweat and foam dripping from his coat. He had deep scratches on his shoulder where the cat had tried to latch on, and blood trickled down his black leg. But he stood tall. He stood like a king. Slowly, the adrenaline faded, leaving Elias trembling. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his chest pinned him down. He groaned. At the sound, Brimstone's ears flicked. The horse turned. He lowered his massive head, his nostrils flaring as he smelled the blood on Elias. He didn't shy away. He took a step forward, careful not to step on the man, and nudged Elias's hand with his velvet nose. He blew a soft, warm breath onto Elias's face. It was an apology. It was a check-in. It was the wildest thing Elias had ever known, showing him the gentlest mercy. Elias reached up with a shaking hand and stroked the horse's muzzle. Tears, hot and unbidden, spilled from his eyes, cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "You crazy fool," Elias whispered, his voice breaking. "You could have run. Why didn't you run?" Brimstone just blinked, his dark eyes soft and liquid. He stayed there, standing guard over the fallen cowboy, watching the open door. He wouldn't leave. Not now. Not ever. If this moment of loyalty moved you, and if you believe that animals have souls just as deep as ours, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. It means a lot to hear from you. The rest of the day was a blur of pain and survival. Elias managed to crawl to his pack and find a strip of clean cloth to bind his chest. It wasn't deep enough to kill him, but it would leave a scar to match the ones on his heart. He used the last of the water to clean Brimstone's scratches, applying a dab of pine sap to seal the wounds. They huddled together as the sun went down, the broken door propped up with the remains of the table. They didn't sleep. They just existed, sharing the warmth, two battered soldiers in a war against the elements. By the next morning, the weather had broken. The sun rose on a world that was blindingly bright and still. The snow was melting. Elias knew they had to move. He couldn't ride. His body was too broken, and Brimstone was limping slightly from the kick. They walked out of the cabin together, side by side. Elias held the mane for balance, and Brimstone adjusted his pace to the man's slow, painful shuffle. It took them 2 days to get back to the double bar. 2 days of sleeping in snow caves, of sharing the last crumbs of jerky, of drinking from icy streams. When they finally crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, they looked like apparitions. Elias was grey-faced, his clothes in tatters, blood dried on his shirt. Brimstone was gaunt, his coat matted with mud and dried blood. Silas was in the corral when they walked in. The foreman dropped the rope he was holding. The other hands came out of the bunkhouse silent. They had given Elias up for dead days ago. They stared at the man and the horse, expecting to see a broken cowboy and a wild beast. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Elias didn't lead the horse. He didn't hold a rope. He walked with his hand resting lightly on Brimstone's withers, and the horse, the devil in the flesh, walked with his head low, matching Elias step for step. When a dog barked, running out to greet them, Brimstone didn't spook. He just shifted slightly to put himself between the dog and Elias. Silas walked up to them, taking off his hat. He looked at the wounds on the horse, then at the bandages on Elias. He saw the way the horse watched him, not with fear but with a protective warning. "I thought you were a goner, Thorn," Silas said quietly. "I thought that horse would kill you." Elias stopped. He leaned his forehead against Brimstone's neck, closing his eyes for a moment. He felt the horse's strength, the solid, undeniable reality of him. "He didn't kill me, Silas," Elias rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion. "He saved me." Elias unclipped the lead rope from the halter. He stood back. "Guy's not a wild horse anymore," Elias said, "but he ain't tame either. He's free and he's with me." He turned to walk toward the bunkhouse, his legs shaking. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. He heard the heavy, rhythmic crunch of hooves following him. Brimstone was right at his heel, walking him home. Winter didn't let go of the valley easily that year. It clung to the eaves of the barn and the shadows of the pines for weeks, but inside the double bar, the ice had already broken. Elias spent the next month in a state of quiet recovery, his chest wrapped tight, his movements slow and deliberate. But he wasn't recovering in the bunkhouse with the other men. He moved his bedroll permanently into the tack room, just a thin wall away from Brimstone's stall. The horse healed faster than the man, as animals often do. The scratches from the lion scarred over, leaving jagged white lines against his black coat. Badges of honor that the other ranch hands eyed with a mixture of fear and reverence. The dynamic on the ranch had shifted. The men who had once placed bets on when Elias would be stomped now gave him a wide berth, nodding with a solemn respect when he passed. They stopped calling him the Ghost. You don't call a man a ghost when he walks out of a blizzard with a devil at his heel. Silas, the foreman, tried to enter Brimstone's stall once to check the feed. The stallion didn't attack, but he pinned his ears and let out a low, vibrating rumble that shook the dust from the beams. Silas backed out slowly, hands raised. "All right," he muttered, pale-faced. "He's a one-man horse. I get it." That was the truth of it. Brimstone hadn't been tamed in the way men usually meant. He hadn't been broken. The fire in him hadn't been doused with water. It had been mixed with Elias's own quiet flame, He was still wild to the world, dangerous and unpredictable, but to Elias he was as gentle as a spring breeze. Elias would spend his evenings sitting on an overturned bucket in the stall, reading by lantern light or just whittling, and Brimstone would rest his chin on the man's shoulder, breathing in the scent of tobacco and wool. They spoke a language that didn't need words, a dialogue of small movements and shared silence. As the weeks turned into months, the snow finally retreated to the highest peaks. The valley floor turned a brilliant, aching green, and the creek swelled with meltwater. It was time. Elias's ribs had knit, and his shoulder, though stiff, was strong enough. He walked into the stall one morning, carrying the saddle. Brimstone turned, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. He didn't flinch at the leather. He stood rock-still, chewing lazily on a mouthful of hay, as Elias cinched the girth. They rode out of the barnyard at a walk, the other hands stopping their work to watch. There was no bucking, no fighting. Elias sat deep in the saddle, and Brimstone moved with a fluid, coiled power like a loaded spring. They rode past the corrals, past the bunkhouse, and out toward the open range. The air tasted of mud and new life. Elias guided the stallion toward the river, the same river that had nearly taken them both. He needed to go back. He needed to see it. When they reached the bank, the water was high and brown, churning with the violence of the thaw. Elias pulled Brimstone to a halt. He looked at the dark water, and for the first time in 10 years, he didn't see Samuel's face sinking beneath the surface. He didn't feel the crushing weight of the guilt that had bent his back for so long. The river was just a river. It was dangerous, yes, but it was just water. He reached down and patted Brimstone's neck. The horse was calm, watching the current with indifferent eyes. "We beat it, boy," Elias whispered. "We beat the cold, and we beat the dark." The horse snorted and tossed his head, eager to run. Elias smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes and crinkled the corners. He gathered the reins. "All right," he said. "Let's see what you've got." He gave the slightest pressure with his heels, and Brimstone exploded into a gallop. They flew across the meadow, the wind tearing at Elias's hat, the ground blurring beneath them. It wasn't a run of fear, it was a run of pure, unadulterated joy. The horse stretched out his neck, his mane whipping back like a black flag, his hooves drumming a rhythm of freedom on the earth. Elias laughed, a sound that was snatched away by the wind, feeling the immense power of the animal beneath him. They were one creature, fused by trauma and trust, running toward the horizon. They slowed down as they reached the high ridge that overlooked the entire valley. The sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the land. Elias dismounted and loosened the cinch to let the horse breathe. He stood there, looking out over the vast, rugged country that had tried to kill them and had instead forged them into something unbreakable. Brimstone grazed nearby, tearing at the tufts of new grass. After a moment, the stallion lifted his head and walked over to Elias. He nudged the cowboy's arm, almost knocking him off balance. Elias chuckled and wrapped his arm around the horse's neck, burying his face in the coarse mane. He smelled the sweat, the dust, and the wildness. People always said you had to break a horse to ride him. They said you had to show him who was boss. Elias knew better now. You didn't break the spirit. You earned it. You didn't conquer the wild. You survived it together. He had come to this ranch looking for a grave, a place to let his past consume him. Instead, he had found a life. He had found it in the middle of a blizzard, on the edge of a cliff, in the heart of a beast that everyone else had thrown away. The sun dipped below the mountains, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. The air grew cool. Elias tightened the cinch and swung back into the saddle. He didn't need to give a command. Brimstone turned toward home, his ears pricked forward, his step light and sure. "Let's go home, partner," Elias said softly. And as they rode down the trail, disappearing into the twilight, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic beat of hooves on the earth, the heartbeat of the West, wild and free and finally at peace.